The dust of the Black Hills settled on everything that summer of '76, a fine red powder that clung to hope and sorrow alike. For a lone woman, 7 months into her first child, it was the grit under her fingernails, the haze in the air she breathed, a constant reminder of how fragile her world had become. She'd helped a man, an injured Lakota scout, guided by a simple creed of mercy. But in the unforgiving West, no good deed goes unpunished. She never imagined his people would return, not with threats of fire or steel, but with a proposal so audacious, so impossible, it would threaten to tear her world apart, an offer not of gratitude but of marriage. The silence of the plains was a living thing. It had weight pressing in on the small, sturdy cabin from all sides. It was a silence Arian had once cherished when John was there to share it, his quiet presence, a bulwark against the vast emptiness. Now it was a predator stalking the edges of her sanity. 3 months. 3 months since the posse had ridden out full of fire and grim determination, chasing the whispers of a gold strike deep in the Sioux-held Black Hills. John, her husband of 2 years, had been among them. He'd kissed her, his beard rough against her cheek, and promised to be back before the baby came. "Just a little steak, Ellie," he'd said, his blue eyes alight with the fever that had gripped so many men. "Enough to see us through. Enough to build a real future." But the future was now a swollen belly beneath her apron, and a silence that screamed his absence. Only one man had returned, a gaunt figure named Miller, with an arrow-shattered arm, and a story that fell from his lips in broken pieces. An ambush, a hornet's nest of Lakota warriors defending their sacred land. He'd seen John go down overwhelmed. No one else had made it back. The town of Redemption, a day's ride east, had offered its condolences. The preacher, Reverend Michael, had spoken of God's mysterious ways. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, had brought a stew and wept with her. But sympathy was a thin blanket against the coming winter. Arian was now a widow in all but name, a homesteader with a claim she couldn't work, and a child who would be born into a world without a father. Her days fell into a grueling rhythm, dictated by necessity. Tending the small vegetable garden, milking their lone cow. Daisy reinforcing the sod roof, every task was a battle against her changing body and the ever-present ache of grief. She talked to the baby, a constant murmuring stream of consciousness that kept the madness at bay. "Your father, he's a good man," she'd whisper, her hand resting on the tight globe of her stomach. "He's just lost his way home for a spell." It was on a blistering afternoon in late August that the rhythm was broken. She was hauling water from the creek, the twin buckets straining her back, when a flash of movement in the cottonwoods downstream caught her eye. It wasn't the familiar flicker of a deer or the lumbering passage of a bear. This was different. Human. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her first instinct was to run to bolt for the cabin and the rifle mounted over the hearth. The stories of raiding parties were fresh tales of burning homesteads and stolen children whispered in hushed tones in Redemption's general store. She was alone, vulnerable. But she didn't run. Something held her fast. A morbid curiosity, perhaps, or the dregs of a courage she thought had died with John. Slowly she set the buckets down her hand, creeping to the small skinning knife tucked into her belt. She moved toward the trees, her steps silent on the dusty earth. He was lying near the water's edge, half hidden by a tangle of wild raspberry bushes. A Lakota man. He was young, his face a mask of dried blood and dirt, his bare chest slick with sweat. A dark, ugly wound marred his thigh, a ragged tear that looked to be from a bullet inflamed and oozing. His breathing was shallow, a pained rasp in the stillness of the afternoon. He was dying. All the fear, all the warnings, all the stories of savage warriors evaporated in the face of his raw suffering. He wasn't a faceless demon from a campfire tale. He was a man hurt and alone, just as she was. The ingrained prejudice of her time and place fought a brief, fierce battle with the simple, unassailable compassion of her soul. Compassion won. She approached him slowly, her hands held out, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice soft, though she knew he likely didn't understand her words. His eyes fluttered open, dark and delirious with fever. They fixed on her, but there was no recognition, no threat, only a deep well of pain. He tried to push himself up, a guttural sound of agony escaping his lips, before collapsing back. "Easy now," she soothed, kneeling beside him. The smell of infection was sharp and unpleasant. If she did nothing, the fever would consume him by nightfall. If she helped him, what then? What if his people came looking for him? What if the townsfolk found out? They'd call her a traitor, an Indian lover. They might run her out, or worse. She looked at his face, at the proud line of his jaw, now slack with pain, and saw not a Lakota, not an enemy, but another human being on the brink. She thought of John, lying wounded somewhere in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Would someone have shown him mercy? "God forgive me, if this is a mistake," she whispered to the unblinking sky. Getting him back to the cabin was an ordeal that stretched her strength to its absolute limit. He was lean but wiry and dead weight for a woman in her third trimester. She used her shawl as a drag, pulling him inch by painful inch away from the creek bed and up the slight incline to her home. She grunted, she sweat, she cried and she cursed, but she did not stop. By the time she got him through the door, the sun was bleeding across the horizon, and her own body screamed in protest. She laid him on the packed dirt floor, not daring to put him on her and John's bed. With trembling hands, she lit a lantern, the soft glow pushing back the encroaching shadows. Now came the hardest part. She boiled water, her mind a flurry of remembered folk remedies and practical knowledge. She tore strips from one of John's old shirts for bandages. Steeling herself, she took her skinning knife, the only sharp instrument she had, and held it in the lantern's flame until the metal glowed cherry red. She knelt beside him again. "This is going to hurt," she said more to herself than to him. "But this poison has to come out." His eyes were closed, his body shivering despite the heat. She took a deep breath, offered a silent prayer, and cut into the swollen flesh. He screamed a raw animal sound that clawed at the cabin walls. His body arched, his hands flailing. She threw her weight across his chest, pinning him down, tears streaming down her face as she worked. She cleaned the wound as best she could, flushing it with boiled water and whiskey from a bottle John had been saving. The bullet was lodged deep beyond her skill to remove, but she packed the opening with a poultice of crushed yarrow and comfrey leaves, praying it would draw out the infection. For 3 days, he drifted on the tides of fever. Arian lived in a waking nightmare. She forced broth and water between his cracked lips. She changed his dressings, the smell of his wound, a constant presence in the small cabin. She bathed his face with cool cloths, murmuring to him nonsense words of comfort. During the day, she did her chores with one ear cocked toward the cabin, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for riders, white or Indian. At night, she slept fitfully, in a chair by the hearth, the loaded rifle leaning against the wall beside her. In his delirium, he spoke. The words were in a language she didn't understand, guttural and flowing, but the tone was universal. He spoke of battle of horses of the sun. He cried out a name again and again. Kanji. She assumed it was his own. He also spoke another name with a different cadence, a softer sound. Wanbli. On the fourth morning, the fever broke. She awoke to find him watching her, his eyes clear and lucid for the first time. The fear returned cold and sharp. He was no longer a helpless patient. He was a Lakota warrior awake and aware in the home of a white woman. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his gaze sweeping the cabin, taking in the neatly stacked firewood, the sparse but tidy furniture, the rifle over the hearth. His eyes lingered on her swollen belly, and a flicker of something unreadable passed through them. Water, he rasped, his voice rough. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, ladling water from the bucket into a tin cup. She handed it to him, careful to keep her distance. He drank greedily, his Adam's apple bobbing. He handed the cup back, his dark eyes fixed on hers. You, he said, the English word heavily accented but clear. He gestured to his bandaged leg, then to her. You did this. She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. He studied her for a long moment, a silent, intense scrutiny that made her feel as if he were seeing the very marrow of her bones. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the exhaustion, the stubborn set of her jaw. He shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. Why? He asked. The question hung in the air between them. Why? She could have left him to die. It would have been the safer, easier choice. How could she explain the impulse that had guided her? You were hurt, she said, simply finding her voice. I couldn't just leave you. He considered her answer, his expression giving nothing away. He looked around the cabin again at the signs of a life lived alone. Your man? He asked, his gaze flicking to the empty space beside her in the small home. A wave of grief washed over her, fresh and raw. He's gone, she whispered. He went into the Paha Sapa, the Black Hills. He didn't come back. The warrior's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of the sacred hills. A long silence stretched between them. The tension was thick enough to taste. He was the enemy, the very reason her husband was likely dead. She was the intruder, a settler on land that had belonged to his people for generations. Yet here they were bound by an act of unexpected mercy. He finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. He seemed to come to a decision. He pushed himself into a sitting position, hissing in pain as his leg protested. I must go, he said. My people will be searching. You can't, she protested, the nurse in her overriding the fear. Your leg is still weak. The wound could open again. I must, he insisted, his voice laced with an iron will that belied his physical state. He would not be dissuaded. Over the next 2 days, he regained his strength with astonishing speed. Arian continued to feed him her stores of dried meat and cornmeal, dwindling at an alarming rate. They existed in a strange, unspoken truce. They rarely spoke, but a current of awareness flowed between them. He watched her every move, his gaze intense. She learned the rhythm of his presence, the quiet way he moved, the deep rumble of his voice when he occasionally spoke a single word. She learned his name was indeed Kanji. On the 3rd day after his fever broke, he stood. He tested his weight on his injured leg, his face a stoic mask that betrayed no pain. He walked to the door and looked out across the plains, a lone, stark figure against the vast expanse. He turned back to her. "You have a brave heart," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. He then did something that surprised her. He reached into a small leather pouch on his belt, one she hadn't dared to touch. He pulled out a single eagle feather, its white and black markings perfect and pristine. He held it out to her. "For the one who is to come." He set his eyes once again on her stomach. "So he may have the spirit of Wanbli." Eagle. She accepted the feather, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle. She looked at the feather, a sacred object she knew was of immense importance, now resting in her palm. Without another word, he walked out to the door. He didn't look back. He moved with a slight limp, but with a purpose that seemed to straighten his spine with every step. Arian watched from the doorway until he was just a small speck disappearing into the shimmering heat haze of the prairie. The silence that rushed back into the cabin was different. Now, it was heavier, filled with the ghost of his presence and the terrifying weight of the secret she now carried. She clutched the eagle feather, its soft edges a strange comfort and a terrifying omen. She had helped an enemy, and she had a sinking feeling that this was not the end of the story. The days that followed Kanji's departure were thick with a new kind of anxiety. The secret of his presence in her cabin lay like a hot coal in Arian's gut. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching pair of eyes. Every rustle of the wind in the tall grass sounded like the approach of moccasined feet. She hid the eagle feather in her small wooden chest of keepsakes, tucked beneath the lace of her wedding veil, feeling as though it might burn a hole through the wood. A week passed, then two. The rhythm of her lonely existence returned, but the melody had changed. It was now underscored by a thrumming bass note of dread. She made a trip into Redemption for supplies, forcing a smile for Martha and nodding politely to Reverend Michael. The town was buzzing with fresh rumors, tales of increased Lakota sightings near the territories, and a renewed call for the army at Fort Laramie to handle the problem. A man named Silas Croft, a rancher whose land bordered the Sioux territory, and who held considerable influence in the town, was the loudest voice. He was a hard man, with pale, watchful eyes, and a mouth that seemed permanently downturned in judgment. He'd made no secret of his belief that the homesteaders were living on a powder keg. "Mark my words," he declared, holding court on the porch of the general store, his voice carrying to Arian as she loaded her wagon. "Any contact with them heathens is a betrayal. You give 'em an inch, they'll take a mile, and your scalp with it. There's no parleyin' with 'em, only removal." His eyes swept over Arian, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Pity, or perhaps opportunity in their depths. He knew her husband was gone. He knew she was alone. He had approached her a week ago, his condolences barely masking the cold calculation in his offer. He'd buy her claim, he'd said, for a fair price. Enough for her to get back east where a woman on her own belonged. She had refused her pride, stinging at the implication that she was helpless. His smile hadn't reached his eyes. "The prairie is no place for a woman about to be a mother." He'd said the words of veiled threat. "It has a way of swallowing up the weak." The encounter left a bitter taste in her mouth. She felt trapped, a fly in a spider's web with Silas and the hostile plains vying to be the one to consume her. It was a cool morning in mid-September when her world tilted on its axis. The air had the first crisp bite of autumn, a promise of the hardship to come. She was outside, hanging laundry on a line stretched between the cabin and a lone pine when she saw them. They were not a whisper in the cottonwoods or a fleeting shadow. They were a solid, undeniable presence on the horizon. 4 riders, sitting astride their ponies on the ridge, overlooking her claim. They weren't painted for war, but their stillness was more menacing than any war cry. They were statues of brown skin and black hair, stark against the pale blue sky, their lances catching the morning sun. Lakota. Arian froze a wet sheet clutched in her hand. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. They had come for her. Kanji had told them. They knew she had helped him, and now they had come to finish the job, to erase the witness. Her heart seized with a terror so pure it left no room for thought. Her baby. She had to protect her baby. She dropped the sheet and scrambled for the cabin, her breath catching in sobs. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the bar across it. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely lift the rifle from its hooks. She fumbled with the powder and shot loading it with a desperate, clumsy haste. She peered through the small window shutter, her knuckles white where she gripped the sill. The 4 riders began to move, not at a charge, but at a slow, deliberate walk down the ridge and toward her home. They were not an army, but a delegation. Yet to Arian, in her terror, they were the 4 horsemen of her own private apocalypse. She rested the long barrel of the rifle in a crack in the shutter, the cold metal a shocking contrast to her feverish skin. She centered the sights on the chest of the lead rider. Her finger tightened on the trigger. He was a formidable-looking man, older than the others, with a stern, weathered face and hair braided with strips of otter fur. He rode with an air of absolute authority. Just as she was about to pull the trigger to fire the shot that would undoubtedly seal her doom, something stayed her hand. The lead rider raised his own hand, palm open, the universal sign of peace. He brought his horse to a halt, 100 yards from the cabin, well out of easy rifle range. The other 3 followed suit. They simply sat there watching the cabin, their patience as vast and unnerving as the landscape itself. Minutes stretched into an hour. The sun climbed higher. Inside the cabin, Arian was locked in a torment of indecision. Her initial terror began to recede, replaced by a bewildering confusion. If they meant to attack, why wait? Why the gesture of peace? Her gaze fell upon the wooden chest, on the eagle feather. So he may have the spirit of Wanbli. It was a gift, a sign of honor. Was this also a sign of honor? It made no sense. Her mind, steeped in the settlers' narrative of savage, unpredictable Indians, could not process this placid, patient demonstration. Finally, her throat raw, she shouted through the door, "What do you want?" There was no reply, only the wind and the silence. She couldn't stay barricaded in her cabin forever. Her cow needed milking, her chickens needed tending. With her heart in her throat, she made a decision. It was reckless, perhaps, suicidal, but the waiting was its own form of torture. Slowly, she unbarred the door. Holding the rifle in front of her, she stepped out into the blinding sunlight. She squinted at the 4 figures. They remained motionless, their eyes fixed on her. The lead rider dismounted. He moved with a stiff grace, a man accustomed to command. He began to walk toward her, his hands empty and held away from his body. The other 3 remained on their horses, silent sentinels. Arian held her ground, the rifle leveled at his chest. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice shaking but firm. He stopped about 30 paces away. He was even more imposing up close. Scars marked his arms and his eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to hold the wisdom and sorrow of generations. He spoke, and his voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. He did not speak English. He spoke in the same Lakota tongue she had heard from Kanji's fevered lips. He spoke for a long time, his tone measured and formal, his hands making deliberate symbolic gestures. He pointed to the sky, to the earth, to his own heart, and then to her. She understood none of the words, but the gravity of his speech was unmistakable. This was no casual conversation. This was a proclamation. When he finished, he fell silent, his gaze unwavering. Behind him, one of the younger warriors dismounted and came forward, leading a pony. It was a fine animal, a pinto mare with a gentle eye, its back laden with gifts. Not one pony, but 3 more were being led forward. They were laden with thick, beautiful buffalo robes, strings of dried meat, and intricately beaded pouches. Arian stared, dumbfounded. The gifts were a fortune, a bride price. The realization dawned on her with the force of a physical blow. It was so absurd, so utterly insane, that she almost laughed. They weren't here to kill her. They weren't here for revenge. The lead warrior spoke again, and this time he used a few words of broken, halting English, clearly learned from traders and painful negotiations. "Kanji," he said, pointing to himself and his men. "His people." He then pointed at Arian. "Kanji, say you, good woman, strong heart." He paused, searching for the words. The younger warrior who had brought the ponies forward spoke in Lakota, and the leader nodded. "Kanji, need woman?" The leader said, his meaning brutally direct. He gestured to the ponies, the robes. He asked, "For you?" Arian's mind reeled. Ask for her. For her hand. She was a pregnant white woman, a widow, and they were asking for her to marry a man she had known for a handful of days. A man who was her sworn enemy by every standard she had ever been taught. "No," she breathed the word, a choked whisper. "No, you don't understand." The leader's expression hardened. In his culture, his offer was one of immense respect. Kanji was a respected scout. The man before her, as she would later learn, was his older brother Tokala, a powerful war chief. He had come to honor a debt, to forge a connection with a woman his brother had marked as possessing a powerful spirit. To refuse was not just a rejection of a proposal, it was a profound insult. "Kanji, warrior," Tokala said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "You, his woman. Now." The situation was spiraling into a nightmare of cultural misinterpretation. They saw her act of mercy not as Christian charity, but as a sign that she was unattached and had chosen to bind her fate to his. They saw her strength not as the desperation of a lonely widow, but as a desirable trait for the mother of a warrior's children. They weren't asking. In their own way, they were formalizing what they believed she had already started. "I can't," she said, her voice rising with hysteria. "I have a husband. Well, I mean, he's gone, but I'm carrying his child." She gestured emphatically to her swollen belly, as if it were a shield. Tokala's eyes followed her gesture. He exchanged a look with the other warriors. He spoke to them in rapid Lakota. There was no look of surprise or revulsion. To her horror, his expression seemed to approve. He turned back to her. "Good," he said, nodding. "You make strong son. For Kanji, for our people." In their world, a child was a blessing regardless of its father. A strong woman who could bear children was a prize. Her pregnancy, far from being a deterrent, was a confirmation of her value. Panic seized her. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a transaction that in their eyes was already complete. The ponies and robes were not an offer. They were the seal on the deal. She was standing in front of 4 armed warriors on an isolated homestead, being told she was now the property of a man she barely knew. "No!" She screamed, the word tearing from her throat. She raised the rifle again, its weight a familiar deadly comfort. "Get off my land, all of you, now!" Tokala's face became a mask of stone. The brief flicker of English was gone, replaced by the cold, hard authority of a war chief who had been dishonored. He spoke a sharp command to his men. They did not draw their weapons, but their bodies tensed their hands, moving to rest on the knives and war clubs at their belts. The air crackled with imminent violence. Irian stood alone, a pregnant woman with an old rifle against 4 seasoned warriors, and a cultural chasm as wide and deep as the canyons of the West. She had saved one man's life, and in return his people had come not to thank her, but to claim her. Her act of compassion had become a death sentence. The standoff held for a long, breathless moment. The sun beat down, glinting off the barrel of Arian's rifle and the obsidian eyes of the warriors. Tokala's face was unreadable, a mask of offended dignity. He had made an honorable gesture according to the laws of his people, offering a great price for the woman who had saved his brother. Her shrieking refusal was an insult he could not easily ignore. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, as one of the younger warriors began to inch his pony forward with a snarl. A new sound cut through the air. It was the thud of horses' hooves coming fast from the east, from the direction of redemption. Everyone turned. A lone rider was cresting the nearby rise, pushing his horse to a gallop. He was a white man, gaunt and disheveled, riding with a desperate urgency. As he drew closer, Irian's heart stopped. The rifle slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the hard-packed dirt. Her hands flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. The man's clothes were in tatters. His face was covered in a thick, unkempt beard, and his skin was burned dark by the sun. But she would have known him anywhere. The way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders, it was unmistakable. "John," she whispered. It was a ghost riding out of the sun. Her husband, whom she had mourned for dead, was alive. He was home. John pulled his lathered horse to a skidding halt, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. He took in the scene in a single horrified glance, his wife pale and trembling. 4 armed Lakota warriors in his yard, a string of gift-laden ponies, and the rifle lying in the dust between them. He could only draw one conclusion. He had returned from hell only to find it had followed him home. "Ellie!" he roared, vaulting from the saddle before the horse had even fully stopped. "Get behind me!" He didn't have a rifle, only a pistol tucked into his belt, but he drew it with a practiced speed that spoke of recent violent experience. He shoved Arian behind him, his thin body a protective shield, and faced Tokala. "What in God's name is going on here?" he yelled, his voice ragged with exhaustion and fury. "Get away from my wife! Get off my land before I send you all to meet your maker!" Tokala's eyes narrowed. He did not understand all the words, but the man's tone and drawn weapon were a universal language. He looked from the wild-eyed man to Arian, who was now weeping openly, her hands reaching for her husband. He saw the way she clung to him, the way he stood before her. The husband she claimed was gone. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in Tokala's chest. He had been deceived. This woman had lied. She was not unattached. She had a man. This changed everything. His honorable offer was now a source of great shame. He had tried to claim another man's woman. He spat a harsh stream of Lakota at his warriors. Instantly their friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by the cold readiness of battle. Bows were gripped. Lances were shifted into fighting position. The misunderstanding had curdled into a deadly confrontation. "John, no. It's not what you think," Arian cried, tugging at his torn shirt. "Put the gun down. Please." "Not what I think," John shot back. His eyes still locked on Tokala. "I see 4 armed savages threatening my wife. I've spent the last 3 months fighting my way back from a Sioux ambush, and I'll be damned if I let them take you from our home." His words hit Arian like a physical blow. An ambush. He had been there. He had seen the other side of the conflict she had so naively tried to bridge. Suddenly, from the direction of redemption, came more riders. A posse. At the lead was Silas Croft, his face a grim mask of satisfaction, a rifle held across his saddle. He had seen John ride wildly out of town, and smelling trouble had quickly gathered a dozen men. "Hold your ground, John," Silas bellowed, his voice ringing with authority. "We've got you covered. Don't you worry. We'll take care of this heathen filth." The situation had exploded. Arian's front yard had become a tinderbox, with John and Silas on one side, Tokala and his warriors on the other, and she, the unwitting spark, trapped in the middle. "Silas, no!" Arian screamed, turning to the approaching townsman. "It's a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Mrs. Miller, is why you're still consorting with them after what they did to your husband," Silas retorted, his eyes cold and hard. He had found the perfect pretext. He would be the town hero, driving off the Indian threat, and in the process cementing his control. Tokala and his warriors were now surrounded. They were outnumbered 4 to 1. But they were proud men, and they would not be cowed. They drew themselves up, ready to die fighting, rather than suffer further dishonor. "John, listen to me," Arian pleaded, her voice desperate. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "They weren't threatening me. They brought gifts. They thought you were dead. They came to ask for my hand for the man I helped." John stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. "The man you helped? What are you talking about? A scout. I found him by the creek. He was wounded. I brought him here. I saved his life." The blood drained from John's face. He looked at the Lakota warriors with new eyes, not just as enemies, but as the people of a man his wife had sheltered under their own roof. Then his eyes fell on the lead pony, on the fine buffalo robes, a bride price. The full insane reality of the situation crashed down upon him. His wife's act of mercy had been twisted into a marriage proposal that had brought them all to the brink of a massacre. "Dear God, Ellie," he whispered. Tokala, meanwhile, was watching this exchange. He saw the woman pleading with her husband. He heard the name of his brother Kanji spoken between them. He did not understand the details, but he began to grasp the shape of the truth. The woman had not lied. She had believed her man was dead. Her actions had been those of a widow. His own actions, while based on a falsehood, had been honorable. The dishonor came from the white men with rifles who now surrounded him, led by the one called Silas, whose eyes burned with a familiar hateful fire. It was Silas who pushed the situation over the edge. "Enough talk," he roared to his men. "Let's give 'em a taste of redemption. Justice fire." But before any of his men could obey, Arian broke free from John. She ran into the open space between the two groups, her arms spread wide, her pregnant belly a stark and vulnerable shield. "Stop!" she shrieked, her voice filled with a power no one had ever heard from her before. "You will not shed blood on this land today." Everyone froze. Silas's men, their fingers on their triggers. Tokala's warriors, their arrows half drawn. John, his pistol still raised. They all stared at the lone, pregnant woman who had placed herself directly in the line of fire. She turned first to Silas, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "You, Silas Croft, you don't want justice. You want my land. You have wanted it since the day you heard my husband was missing. You are using this, using my family's pain, to stir up hatred, so you can pick the bones. You are the only savage here." A murmur went through the posse. Silas's face turned purple with rage, but her words had struck a chord of truth that some of the men couldn't ignore. Then she turned to face Tokala. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She didn't have his language, but she had to try. She pointed to John. "My husband," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not gone." She then placed a hand on her heart, and then on her belly. "His son. My husband's son." She then looked Tokala directly in the eye. She remembered the name Kanji had spoken in his fever dream. The other name. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the eagle feather. She held it up for him to see. "Kanji," she said. Then she spoke the other name, the one he had whispered with such reverence. "Wanbli." At the sight of the feather and the sound of that name, Tokala's stony expression finally broke. A look of profound shock followed by a dawning understanding crossed his face. Wanbli. Eagle. It was not just a symbol. It was the name of his and Kanji's own deceased father, a great and respected chief. Kanji had not just given her a feather. He had bestowed upon her unborn child the spirit name of their ancestor. This was a gesture of immense, almost sacred honor. A debt that went far beyond a simple marriage proposal. Kanji had not asked for her hand out of desire, but out of a deep spiritual obligation. He was trying to bind this woman of strong heart to their family, to protect the woman who had saved him and who was carrying a child he had already blessed. Tokala looked at Arian, at her belly, at the feather at the returned husband. He finally understood the tangled knot of honor, mercy, and misunderstanding. He lowered his lance. He spoke a quiet, firm command to his warriors. One by one, they relaxed their weapons. The immediate threat of violence receded like a fast-moving tide. Tokala looked at John, a long, appraising look, from one warrior to another. He gave a single sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. Then he turned his gaze back to Arian. He placed his fist over his heart and bowed his head slightly. It was a sign of respect so profound that it silenced everyone. He turned without another word, mounted his pony, and with a final command, led his men away. They did not rush. They retreated with the same proud, deliberate dignity with which they had arrived, leaving the gift ponies and the robes behind in the dust. The yard was suddenly shockingly quiet. The posse of men looked uncertainly at each other, then at Silas, whose face was a thunderous mask of thwarted ambition, and finally at John and Arian, who stood together, trembling in the aftermath of the storm. John slowly lowered his pistol. He looked at his wife, at her fierce, tear-streaked face, at the impossible courage she had just shown. He had left behind a wife. He had come home to a warrior. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time in 3 long months, he felt the fragile, tentative stirrings of hope. The crisis was over, but the ground beneath their feet had been irrevocably changed. Nothing would ever be the same. The departure of Tokala and his warriors did not bring peace, but a heavy, echoing silence that pressed down from the vast sky. The space they had occupied felt charged, humming with the ghost of violence narrowly averted. The men of the posse, their bloodlust cooled to a thick, greasy shame, avoided looking at each other. They had ridden out for a simple fight, but the reality had been a complex lesson in honor and misunderstanding, and their role in it felt ugly. One by one they muttered excuses and began to peel off their retreat, far quieter than their grim advance. Silas Croft was the last to leave. He sat upon his horse like a malevolent statue, his face a thunderous mask of thwarted ambition. The hero's mantle he had so eagerly sought to claim now lay in tatters at his feet, and he directed the full force of his humiliation at the 2 people standing before him, his pale eyes cold as river stones fixed on them. "You've made a terrible mistake," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You've chosen them over your own kind. This town won't forget it." The quiet threat was more chilling than any shout. He wheeled his horse around with a savage jerk and galloped away, a dark cloud of resentment trailing in his wake. When he was gone, a collective shudder passed through both Arian and John. The adrenaline that had held them upright fled in a sudden, debilitating rush. Arian trembled so violently, she feared her legs would give out, while John, already worn thin by his ordeal, looked as if he might collapse. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperate strength. "Ellie!" He started, his voice thick with an emotion that was part awe, part disbelief. "What you did, I've never seen anything like it." "I thought you were dead, John." She sobbed into the ragged fabric of his shirt, the carefully constructed dam of her composure finally breaking. Months of solitary grief and fear poured out of her. "I thought I was all alone." "I almost was," he murmured into her hair, his hands coming up to trace her face before moving down with a tender reverence to cup her swollen belly. His touch was a question and a statement all at once. He was relearning the geography of his own life. "They captured me, spent months in their camp. I saw how they live. I escaped a week ago, just started walking east." He looked towards the distant ridge where the warriors had disappeared, his expression a complicated tapestry of hatred and grudging respect. "It's strange," he said, his voice distant. "The ones who held me, they were hard men. But there was a code. I was a prisoner, but not an animal to be tormented. Not like Silas wanted to treat them today. Looking at him, he was the savage." The simple black and white hatred he'd carried into the hills had been stained with shades of grey. The journey ahead of them was as difficult as the plains themselves. John's miraculous return did not magically heal all that was broken. He was haunted by his captivity, prone to long, dark silences. He would wake from sleep with a strangled cry, his hands clenched, the muscle in his jaw tight. He had to reacquaint himself with a wife who was no longer just the quiet woman he had left, but a fierce matriarch who had stared down a war party. And he had to come to terms with Kanji. This was the hardest part, a jagged stone in his soul. The knowledge that a Lakota warrior, one of the very people who had stolen months of his life, had been nursed back to health in his marriage bed, was a profound violation. In his darkest moments, a hot, jealous anger simmered within him. Yet he could not escape the tangled, undeniable fact. This same man's people had been turned away from a bloody confrontation by the fierce loyalty of the wife he had saved. The debt was a knot of violence and mercy he struggled to unpick. The gifts were a constant physical reminder. The 4 pinto ponies grazed peacefully with their lone cow. Inside the cabin, the pile of buffalo robes was a source of both comfort and consternation, a fortune in warmth and wealth. Yet for a week, John wouldn't touch them. They were the bride price, a galling symbol of what he had almost lost. "We should burn them," he said one evening, his voice flat as he watched Arian run a hand over the supple hide of the top robe. Arian looked up, her expression calm. "No, John. They weren't just a price. They were an apology and an honor, both at once." In the end, Tokala understood the mistake. He left them as a sign of respect. To refuse them now would be to throw the peace we bought today back in their faces. It would be an insult, and I don't think we can afford any more insults. Her logic was inescapable, a cool balm on his hot pride. He was a practical man. The ponies were fine animals, and the robes would be vital for the coming winter, especially for the baby. A few days later, Arian saw him from the cabin window, quietly leading the pintos to the creek. His movements were stiff at first, but by the time he led them back, a small measure of the tension had left his shoulders. He was accepting. Their life settled into a new, fragile rhythm. Their relationship with redemption, however, was fractured. Silas Croft, true to his word, had spread his poison effectively. The story that circulated was a twisted version of events where the Millers had sided with hostiles. John was met with cold shoulders and suspicious glares in town. Men who had once clapped him on the back now turned away. Only Martha, the blacksmith's wife, dared to breach the quarantine. "Don't you mind them?" she said, pressing a small sack of sugar into John's hands he hadn't paid for. "Silas is just a bitter old fool mad, because Arian showed him up for the coward he is. Most folks are just sheep, John." But they were isolated now, an island in the vast sea of the prairie. In their shared exile, however, they began to truly find one another again. In the quiet evenings, John finally talked, unburdening himself of the stories of his captivity. Arian in turn spoke of her profound fear and the strange silent understanding she'd had with Kanji. They were forging a new marriage, one not built on naive dreams, but on hard-won truths tempered in the fires of loss and a courage they never knew they possessed. 2 months later, as the first heavy snows blanketed the plains, Arian went into labor. It was a long, arduous birth, with the wind howling outside. John, clumsy and terrified, was her only help, coached by his wife's own gritted teeth instructions. In those hours he felt a profound, humbling respect for her strength. As a pale winter dawn broke, a new cry joined the whistling of the wind. A son. He was a healthy, lusty baby, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that promised to be as clear and blue as his father's. John took the small, squirming bundle from Arian, and as he looked down at his son, the trauma of the past months finally broke, washing away in a tide of pure love. He wept silent tears carving paths through the grime on his cheeks. They named him Caleb. But later that day, as Arian held him close, her gaze fell upon the single eagle feather. It now hung from a leather thong over the rough-hewn cradle John had built. She knew her son had another name, a spirit name, a secret bond to the people who lived beyond the ridge. Wanbli. It was not a name of conflict or ownership. It was a name of honor, a name that signified not the clash of two worlds, but the stubborn power of a single act of kindness and the unexpected scars it could leave behind, scars that in the right light looked a lot like bridges. Their life would be hard, their place in the world uncertain. But as she listened to the twin sounds of her husband's soft humming and her baby's gentle breaths, for the first time in a long time, the silence of the plains felt like peace. The story of Arian and John isn't just a tale from the Wild West. It's a testament to the complex, often contradictory nature of the human heart. It reminds us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. It shows how mercy can be mistaken for weakness, and honor can be lost in translation, leading good people to the brink of tragedy. Their journey, born from a single act of compassion, forever altered their family and their community, proving that the deepest divides can sometimes be bridged by the most unlikely hands. If this story of grit survival and the dramatic clash of cultures on the American frontier resonated with you, please consider giving this video a like and sharing it with others who appreciate tales of real-life drama. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the forgotten corners and untold sagas of the West. Click that bell icon so you won't miss what's coming next.